Bill Maher and Glenn Greenwald went at it over the weekend about NSA spying and Edward Snowden. They largely agreed, but on one point they had a tense back and forth.
I can see his point a little bit. I mean, he's obviously still mad at Edward Snowden. He mentioned that. And of course, Edward Snowden gave 1.7 million secret documents to you, which I know you are personally going through right now and deciding what should be released. I can understand why the President of the United States would say, you know, I was elected to this office. How come Glenn Greenwald gets to decide what's classified in America?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, for that point of view, there's this thing called the Constitution, the First Amendment of which guarantees a free press. And if you go back to the Pentagon Papers, where Daniel Ellsberg, who's widely considered a hero, took it upon himself to give many thousands of pages to the New York Times, and those two parties that weren't elected, Daniel Ellsberg and the New York Times, decided which of those secret documents the American people should learn about, and it was profoundly important to learn that our government was lying about the war. Same thing throughout the Bush years. I didn't hear any liberals saying, how come whistleblowers took it upon themselves to reveal the Bush torture program, or the NSA warrantless eavesdropping program, or Abu Ghraib abuses, also things that were kept secret. And the reason is that part of our democracy requires that when the government keeps things secret, that the citizenry has a right to know, like the fact that they're building a massive spying apparatus that's aimed directly at us, that it's up to whistleblowers in the government and then a free press to report it. That's as much a part of how our democracy functions as going to the ballot booth, electing leaders, and then putting your blind trust in the fact that they're going to do the right thing.
But would you not agree that some things need to be secret?
Sure, and that's the reason that although the count that you said before was the number that Edward Snowden gave us is actually a wildly inflated account that comes from the government, but he did give us a lot of documents. And what he said when he did that was, I don't think all of this should be public. There's a lot in here that I'm giving you for your own edification to understand how the system works as journalists, but I don't want this published. And the vast majority of what he gave us, what he gave the Washington Post, hasn't been published yet, and much of it will never be at his request, precisely because the government does have some things that it keeps legitimately secret. But among those things that the government keeps legitimately secret is not the fact that they're collecting everybody's communication data, regardless of whether you've done anything wrong, or the fact that they're able to invade Facebook and Google and Yahoo without any kind of court supervision. Those are the kinds of things that citizens have a right to know in a healthy democracy.
Yeah, I understand that. I just think there is something to be said for, well, if it's all open, why don't we get to choose who decides? Now, I think if we were going to decide, you actually would be a pretty good guy to decide, because I respect you and I like you and I think you're very smart. But what if it was Perez Hilton? You know, I mean, okay. Let me just ask you this. I mean, I also respect Edward Snowden. Obviously, this debate wouldn't be happening without Edward Snowden. But I was wondering if you would agree with me that every time he opens his mouth, he also says something completely nuts. He reminds me a lot of Ron Paul. I agree with what he says, I nod along, and then he says something totally batshit. I mean, Edward, let me give you some quotes from Edward. Go ahead.
All right, go ahead.
Here are some Edward Snowden quotes.
All right, go ahead.
He said, these programs were never about terrorism. They're about social control and diplomatic manipulation. Well, that's crazy. They were about stopping terrorism. They may have gone too far. But everybody in the government isn't out to get you. He said, they can use this system to go back in time and scrutinize every decision you've ever made, every friend you've ever discussed something with. This is nuts, right?
No, Bill, what's nuts is the fact that you think that's nuts. And let me just explain why. A lot of the stories that we've reported have nothing to do with terrorism. They're spying on economic summits in Latin America, oil companies in Brazil, democratically elected leaders of our closest allies who have nothing to do with terrorism. His point is that, of course, some of this is directed at terrorism, but this massive system that has been built, a huge bulk of it, has nothing to do with national security. It has to do with the reason that people in political power always want to surveil their populations is because it does give greater power. And as far as slowing down the internet, that comes right from documents that we publish where the NSA collects everything and then stores it for a long enough time to, in their words, slow down the internet so that they can go back at any time and see your entire history, where you've browsed, what kind of search terms you've entered, with whom you've been speaking. I mean, look, he's a 29-year-old who's not a trained politician. He doesn't have aides whispering in his ear what he should say. He's not adept at that. That's what makes him so impressive. It was an act of conscience that he just stepped forward as an ordinary person and did this. So
no one is arguing with that, Glenn. What I said is every time he opens his mouth, he always says something fucking nuts. And when he says every friend, they know every friend you've ever discussed something with, we'll just have to agree to disagree on what's fucking nuts.
Yeah, except you're wrong, Bill. It's an empirical question, and we know what the answer is. The answer is they can determine everything you've ever done electronically. There's no doubt about that. There's the PRISM program, there's the Blarney program, there's the X-Keyscore program, and what those do, they track your emails, they track your phone calls, they track your text messages. They even have programs that can, if you type something and then delete it into an email, they can still access it, even if you didn't send it. So they really can view absolutely everything. We also just learned that they can get into computers that aren't even connected to the internet. They have a way of, I don't know, somehow getting onto radio waves, and then the radio waves take you to the computer that isn't connected to the internet, and they can figure out what you're doing on a computer that's not connected to the internet. They can absolutely find out everything you've done electronically. So it's not even a slight overstatement. And then to Snowden's other point, that it was never about terrorism, look, maybe you can say that for some people that was the idea. But even if that was the idea, it immediately got corrupted because absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we learned all of the abuses. I mean, are you kidding me? We can go on and on with the abuses. The people at the NSA spying on their ex-boyfriends and girlfriends. They were spying on World of Warcraft. They were able to, there was over 2,000 violations in a single year. They were able to, they had access. The world was at their fingertips. They could figure out secret information in a second. So they're human beings. They're gonna use that not for the things that it was just supposed to be for, even if it was for terrorism. Another example is there was the story that broke that they were siphoning off information to the DEA, and the DEA would then use all that stuff to prosecute people for drug crimes domestically. So Glenn Greenwald is 100% correct. Bill Maher. He did largely agree with Greenwald. There were only certain points where he disagreed, but on the points where he disagreed, Maher was wrong. And also, I think it's fair to say that had this been all under George W. Bush, I think Maher would agree 100% with Glenn Greenwald. So it's a little bit of like, thinking Obama's a good guy and means well that's clouding Maher's judgment in this respect.